For 3 years, I lived in darkness until I learned to recognize the man beside me without ever seeing his face.
You smell wrong.
My name is John, looking for work.
For 3 years, Iyo Adewumi had lived in darkness. Not the peaceful darkness that comes after midnight, when a person closes her eyes knowing that morning will eventually return, but a darkness with no sunrise, no colors, and no familiar face waiting at the other side of it. It began at 9:17 on a Tuesday morning inside the Adewumi Botanical Compound when a distillation vessel exploded with such force that windows shattered across 3 buildings, and a cloud of chemical vapor rolled toward the lagoon. Iyo survived, and everyone called that a miracle. Iyo never understood why. The explosion badly damaged both of her eyes, scarred her throat, and left her unable to speak above a whisper before her voice disappeared completely. The doctors promised that her sight might return. First they said months, then they said years. Eventually, they stopped promising anything. But the strangest wound was not the one inside her eyes. It was the silence of the man who had promised to marry her. Sean Olanru did not visit her in the hospital, not once. His family sent flowers on the first day, fruit on the second, and a lawyer on the third. 11 days after the explosion, Sean's mother came to Mama Anola with a carefully prepared explanation. Her son could no longer continue the engagement. He was afraid, she said, that marrying a woman who might never see again would damage his future and his reputation. Iyo heard the conversation from behind a hospital curtain, unable to answer, unable even to let them see the tears running down her face. She remembered gripping the bedsheet until her fingers hurt. 3 years later, the Adewumi estate still smelled of camphor, wet earth, bitter roots, and medicinal herbs. Iyo sat beside an open window with layers of gauze covering her eyes, listening to rain strike the tiled roof and the distant engines of boats moving across the lagoon. She could not see the water anymore. She could only hear it. Sometimes, when the wind shifted, she could smell the wild jasmine growing near the shore, and that tiny scent became one of the few things that reminded her the world outside her room was still alive. Mama Anola entered quietly and took Iyo's hands. "My child," the old woman said. Iyo turned toward her voice. "The Olanru family has returned." Iyo's fingers immediately tightened. "They want the marriage." For several seconds, she did not move. Then she slowly shook her head. Mami Anola explained that the Adewumi Empire was under pressure. The explosion had destroyed one of its most valuable distillation houses. Several transport contracts had been suspended, and competitors were moving against the family while creditors waited. The Olanru family had offered financial protection, but there was a condition: the marriage had to happen. Iyo's fingers trembled. "So they want my name," she whispered through the damaged throat. "But not me." Mama Anola did not answer. She did not need to. Yet the strangest part of the arrangement had not even been revealed. Sean Olanru had agreed to the marriage only if he did not have to stand beside Iyo himself. Instead, his family had found another man to take his place. His name was Dada. He was the son of a poor widow named Sade, a woman who earned a living dyeing cloth with indigo near the lagoon. Dada owned almost nothing. His clothes were patched, his sandals were worn, and his hands were permanently stained blue from working with plants, roots, and fermented dye. He had no title, no powerful relatives, and no reason to enter a wealthy family's house, except the debt that threatened to put his mother on the street. The Olanrus offered to clear that debt if he agreed to pretend to be Sean. It was an arrangement so reckless that even Dada knew it could ruin him if the truth came out. Still, he accepted. That evening, while rain washed the stone steps of the Adewumi estate, Dada stood outside the enormous gates wearing a borrowed suit that did not quite fit his shoulders. He looked at the mansion, then down at his blue-stained palms. Inside that house was a woman who could no longer see his face, and somewhere beyond the walls was a fortune he had never wanted. Dada did not know that the woman waiting for him would eventually remember him without ever needing to see him. He did not know that his hands, rough from years of work, would become the one piece of evidence no lie could erase. And he certainly did not know that the false marriage he was entering was supposed to last only long enough to protect a business deal. It would last 3 years instead. 3 years in which a blind woman would learn to recognize one man by the warmth of his touch, the sound of his footsteps, and the unmistakable smell of indigo after rain. Dada arrived at the Adewumi estate just after sunset, wearing a borrowed suit that was too wide at the shoulders and a pair of polished shoes that pinched his feet with every step. He had never stood behind gates that tall before, and for a moment he wondered whether the people inside could somehow smell the lagoon mud still clinging to the soles of his shoes. He looked down at his hands. The blue stains were impossible to hide. He had scrubbed them with ash that afternoon until his skin burned, but the indigo had settled too deeply into the cracks around his nails. The Olanru driver beside him noticed. "Keep your hands closed," the man warned. "And remember who you are tonight." Dada looked at him. Sean Olanru, exactly. Dada said nothing. He had repeated that name so many times that it no longer sounded like a person's name. It sounded like a debt. His mother was the reason he had accepted. Sadie had spent 30 years working with indigo vats, carrying bundles of cloth from market to market until the skin around her fingers became permanently rough. Recently, her health had deteriorated, and the landlord had threatened to throw her out because she had fallen behind on rent. The Olanrus knew exactly how desperate she was. They offered to clear every debt if Dada agreed to become Sean for as long as the marriage arrangement required. It was humiliating, dangerous, and absurd. Yet Dada had learned something from poverty. Sometimes a man did not choose between good and bad. Sometimes he chose between two kinds of loss. He stepped through the gates. Inside, servants moved silently beneath golden lamps, carrying trays of food and silver bowls of flowers. Dada suddenly felt like an intruder who had wandered into the wrong world. A servant led him through a long corridor toward Io's room. "She cannot see you," the servant whispered. "She cannot speak either. Do not frighten her." Dada stopped. "Has anyone told her I am not Sean?" The servant looked away. That was all the answer he needed. When the door opened, Dada saw a woman sitting beside the window, with her eyes covered in white medicinal bandages. Io's posture was straight, but there was something painfully still about her, as though she had learned that movement was useless in a world she could no longer see. Dada stood at the doorway. He had been instructed to act like a husband. Instead, he simply said, "Good evening." Io turned toward his voice. Her fingers moved across the blanket. She seemed to be searching for something. "Sean?" she whispered. Dada's throat tightened. The lie was supposed to be simple. Say yes, stay quiet, collect the payment, protect his mother, walk away when it was over. "Yes," he said. The word felt heavier than he expected. Io lowered her head. She did not ask him to come closer. She did not reach for him. That surprised him. He had imagined that a woman who had lost her sight would be desperate for human contact. Instead, Io behaved as though she had already learned not to expect kindness from anyone. Dada took one step forward, then stopped several feet away. "Do you need anything?" She shook her head. He waited. "Are you hungry?" Another shake. "Do you want the window closed?" This time she hesitated before whispering, "Leave it open." Dada nodded. He sat on a wooden chair near the wall. The room became quiet except for the rain outside. After several minutes, Io spoke again. "You smell different." Dada froze. He looked down at his hands. "Different from what?" She turned her face toward him. "I don't know." Dada almost smiled. He had forgotten that the lie was being told to someone who could not see him, but could still sense the world in ways sighted people ignored. He kept his hands folded. "Perhaps it is the rain." Io said nothing. Later that night, when the servants had gone, Dada was shown the bedroom. There was one large bed. He looked at it, then at Io, who was already lying down with her back turned toward him. He picked up a blanket and walked to the floor. "What are you doing?" she asked. "Sleeping. On the floor?" "Yes." She was silent. Then she asked, "Why?" Dada spread the blanket beneath him. "Because this marriage was not my choice, and neither was your condition. I will not make your life harder because of something you did not ask for." Slowly turned toward him, though he knew she could not see. Her lips parted, but no words came. Dada lay down. The floor was cold. He told himself it did not matter. A few minutes later, he heard Io breathing unevenly. He wondered if she was crying. He almost stood, but stopped himself. He did not want to invade the little space she still controlled. The next morning, Dada noticed something unusual. A tray of medicine had been left beside Io's bed, but one bottle smelled wrong. He picked it up and studied the label. He did not know much about palace medicine, but he knew plants. His mother had taught him to recognize herbs, Before he was old enough to read, he uncorked the bottle and smelled it. Something bitter and synthetic cut through the medicinal scent. "Do not take this," he said. Io turned toward him. "Why?" "I don't know yet, but it does not smell like the medicine you were taking yesterday." A servant immediately entered and snapped. "Put that down. The physician prescribed it." Dada handed it back. He said nothing more. But later, while everyone was busy preparing for the wedding ceremony, he quietly asked the kitchen worker where the medicine had come from. The answer bothered him. It had arrived that morning from an outside supplier no one in the family had used before. That night, Dada sat beside the open window and stared at the lagoon. He had entered the Adewumi house to pretend to be another man. He had promised himself he would not become involved. Yet, already he had begun noticing things he could not ignore. Io's medicine was questionable. The servants were afraid to speak. Her family was desperate to preserve a marriage that had already failed. And somewhere outside the estate, the real Sean Olanru was waiting for Dada to finish the job. Dada looked down at his blue-stained hands. He had agreed to wear another man's name. He had not agreed to become another man's conscience. The next morning, he would begin caring for Io himself, and neither of them understood yet that the first small act of kindness would eventually become the reason. A 3-year lie could never survive. The first year of their marriage passed without either of them saying the word love. It would have been easy for Io to hate the man she believed was Sean, especially after everything the real Sean had done. But Dada never gave her enough reason to hate him. He did something much stranger. He stayed. Every morning at 6:10, before the household servants began moving through the corridors, Io would hear his footsteps outside her door, followed by the soft scrape of a wooden chair being pulled into place. He never entered without asking. He never touched her without warning. And when her eyes hurt so badly that she could not sleep, he was usually the one sitting quietly on the other side of the room, saying almost nothing. "Are you there?" she would sometimes ask in the darkness. Yes, that was enough. He learned the geography of her blindness before he learned how to make her smile. He moved the furniture so she would not hit her knees against sharp corners. He tied a small strip of cloth around the railing whenever a step became slippery. He placed her medicine in the same position every evening and never changed it without telling her first. To anyone watching from outside, these were insignificant things. To Io, they were the difference between living inside a prison and learning how to move through a world that had suddenly become unfamiliar. The first time Dada helped her walk across the garden, she refused to hold his arm. "I can do it." "I know. Then why are you following me?" "Because the path has 3 broken stones." Stopped. "How do you know?" "I nearly broke my ankle on the second one yesterday." She almost laughed. Almost. Dada did not mention that he had deliberately walked the path first so he could memorize every obstacle before bringing her there. Months passed. Io began to recognize him without asking. She knew the rhythm of his footsteps. She knew the quiet cough he made when he had been working with indigo too long. She knew the faint smell that remained on his clothes even after he washed them. Crushed leaves, fermented dye, wet bark, and sometimes jasmine from the lagoon. She especially knew his hands. His palms were rougher than those of anyone who had ever touched hers. The skin near his fingers was hardened by years of work, and tiny stains of blue seemed to live permanently beneath his nails. One evening, while Dada was helping her apply ointment around the edges of her bandages, Io reached out and caught his wrist. He froze. "Your hands are cold," she whispered. They were in the water. At this hour? The dye needed washing. She traced one rough knuckle with her fingertip. "You work too much," he smiled. "Someone has to." She did not let go immediately. Neither of them spoke. Then she released him. It was only a few seconds, but Dada carried those seconds with him for weeks. Their closeness grew in strange, quiet ways. Io began asking about the lagoon. Dada described the color of the water after rain, the fishermen pulling their nets toward shore, the narrow boats carrying sacks of herbs, and the white herons that stood motionless among the reeds. "What do they look like?" Io asked one afternoon. "Like they are waiting for someone." For whom? Dada thought about it. Perhaps they don't know yet. She smiled at that answer. He began telling her about plants too, and she discovered that Dada could identify herbs almost entirely by smell. He could tell fresh lemongrass from dried lemongrass without touching either. He could distinguish two varieties of bitter leaf from several steps away. Once, when a shipment arrived from a supplier, he opened one sack, smelled the contents, and immediately told the head gardener that the leaves had been stored beside kerosene. Nobody believed him until the smell was found deep inside the fibers. Slowly, Io stopped thinking of him as the man who had entered her room under another man's name. She began thinking of him simply as Dada. The lie remained, but the person inside it became real. During the second rainy season, Io had a fever that lasted 4 nights. On the third night, she woke sweating and confused, reaching for water that was not there. Dada was beside her before she could call. He lifted the cup to her lips and supported her head with one hand. She drank, then whispered, "Sean." Dada went still. She was half asleep. She did not know what she had said. He placed the cup down and stared at her face beneath the dim lamp. For one terrible moment, he wanted to tell her everything. Instead, he said, "Rest." In the morning, she remembered nothing, but he did. So did the lie. By the beginning of the third rainy season, something had changed between them that neither was willing to name. Io began waiting for his footsteps. When he was away for several hours, she noticed. When he returned late, she became restless. One evening, he came back from the dye house with his hands covered in dark blue stains. He tried to hide them behind his back, but Io noticed the movement. "What happened?" "Nothing." "Show me." Dada hesitated. She held out her hand. He placed his palm against hers. The contrast was almost painful. Her skin was soft from years of palace life. His was scarred, rough, and warm. Io turned his hand over slowly. "These hands have worked harder than anyone I know." Dada gave a quiet laugh. "They are just hands." Io shook her head. "No, they are the hands I remember." He looked at her, though she could not see him. That sentence stayed between them. The next morning, Dada found Io sitting alone near the window. She had removed one small strip of gauze because the doctors had begun testing her vision. She could not yet see clearly, but she could distinguish light from darkness. A thin golden line from sunrise touched the floor. Io reached toward it with trembling fingers. "I think I saw something." Dada stopped in the doorway. "What?" "Light." He did not move. She turned toward him. "Don't tell anyone yet." "Why?" "Because I am afraid." For the first time, Dada understood that her recovery frightened her, almost as much as blindness had. Darkness had become familiar. Sight meant facing everything she had lost. It meant seeing the man who had abandoned her. It meant discovering whether the voice inside her memories matched the face in front of her. Dada sat beside her. He did not offer advice. He simply placed his hand on the table between them. After a moment, Io found it. Her fingers closed around his. Outside, rain began falling over the lagoon. Neither of them spoke. They did not need to. By then, Io could recognize Dada from across a room without seeing him. She knew him by the sound of his breathing, by the faint scent of indigo on his sleeves, and by the warmth that traveled through his rough hands whenever he helped her stand. She had no idea that within weeks, those very senses would expose the greatest lie in the Adewumi household. And Dada had no idea that the day Io finally opened her eyes, she would look at him once and know exactly who had been beside her all along. By the beginning of the third rainy season, there was one question the people inside the Adewumi estate had started asking quietly. Who was Dada really? He had entered the household as a poor substitute groom. Yet somehow, he understood the botanical business better than men who had spent decades working in it. He could walk through the herb gardens and identify plants without looking at their leaves. He could smell spoiled roots before anyone noticed their color had changed. Once, when an entire shipment of dried jasmine arrived from the northern suppliers, Dada opened one sack, took a single breath, and told the warehouse manager that the flowers had been stored too close to smoke. The manager laughed at him until the next morning, when the entire shipment was rejected by a major perfume buyer. Dada never asked for credit. He simply went back to work. At night, however, he became someone else. After the household had gone quiet, he would walk behind the old distillation house, carrying a piece of charcoal and several scraps of cement paper. Under the weak light of a lantern, he drew strange diagrams, pipes connecting one vessel to another, cooling channels, filters made from layered plant fibers, and a redesigned distillation system that could recover oils the old equipment wasted. Beneath every drawing he made the same small mark, a white heron standing beside a curved line representing the lagoon. Io knew nothing about the drawings. She only knew that Dada often returned after midnight smelling of smoke, wet earth, and crushed leaves. One night she heard him enter the room and asked, "Where have you been?" Dada stopped. "Outside." "I know that." He smiled despite himself. "Then why ask?" "Because you smell like something I don't recognize." He looked down at his hands. "Maybe that is because I have been trying something new." She reached for him, and he placed his hand in hers. "Your fingers are stained again." "They always are." Io smiled. "You are a terrible husband." Dada laughed softly. "I thought I was improving." She shook her head. "You are still terrible at lying." The words struck him harder than she intended. For a moment, neither moved. Io could not see his expression, but she felt the tension in his hand. Then she released him. "Go to sleep," she whispered. "Tomorrow you will have to help me walk." Dada nodded. But outside the room he stood for a long time, wondering whether she had begun to suspect the truth. Meanwhile, rumors about the mysterious white heron had begun circulating among Lagos merchants. Years earlier, several small botanical producers had quietly improved their distillation yields, using designs attributed to an unknown engineer who never appeared in public. Nobody knew his face. Nobody knew his name. All they had was a symbol, a white heron. One afternoon, an elderly merchant named Chief Akinwal visited the Adewumi compound to inspect a shipment. While waiting near the garden, he noticed a sheet of cement paper lying beneath a stack of empty sacks. He picked it up. His eyes stopped on the drawing. The room seemed to change around him. "Where did you get this?" he asked the gardener. The gardener shrugged. "One of the workers draws at night." "Who?" Before the gardener could answer, Dada appeared at the far end of the courtyard. He saw the paper in the old man's hand and immediately stopped. Chief Akinwal looked from the drawing to Dada, but said nothing. He simply folded the paper and returned it. That evening, Dada burned every unfinished drawing he had hidden near the distillery. He believed the secret was safe. He was wrong. Because Sean Olanru had returned to Lagos 2 weeks earlier, and he had begun asking questions too. He learned that Io's health was improving. He learned that her doctors were preparing to remove the bandages from her eyes. And he learned one more thing that frightened him, more than the loss of the marriage itself. Io had begun trusting the man pretending to be him. Sean had expected Dada to remain invisible, a poor man who would collect his mother's debt payment and disappear. Instead, Dada had become the person Io waited to hear every morning. Sean did not know about the white heron drawings yet, but he knew enough to understand that the man he had hired to protect his fortune might soon become the man standing between him and everything he wanted. And 3 rainy seasons after Io entered the darkness, the day she would finally open her eyes was getting dangerously close. For 3 years, the Adewumi estate had waited for this night, but nobody waited more anxiously than Io. The great hall had been prepared before sunset. Lamps burned along the walls. Musicians sat quietly near the far veranda, and merchants from across Lagos gathered beneath the carved wooden ceiling, whispering about the daughter who had survived an explosion that should have killed her and might finally see again. Io sat in the center of the room with her hands folded tightly in her lap. The final layers of medicinal gauze covered her eyes, and for the first time in 3 years, she could feel the weight of expectation pressing against her. Mama Anola stood beside her. "Are you ready?" Io swallowed. Her throat was still weak, but her voice had returned enough for a whisper. "I don't know. You don't have to be brave for them." Io turned toward her grandmother. "I am not afraid of the light." She paused. "I am afraid of what I will see when it comes." Across the room, Sean Olanru watched from beneath the golden lamps. He had arrived that afternoon, wearing an expensive dark suit and a fragrance so strong that several people noticed it before he entered the room. He had spent the last 3 years avoiding Io, but tonight he stood among the family as if he had never abandoned her. He had rehearsed his story carefully. He would tell her that he had never stopped loving her. He would say that he had stayed away only because he had been told she needed peace. He would tell everyone that he had secretly arranged the medicines, paid the doctors, and waited patiently for her recovery. The lie was ridiculous, but Sean believed that people often accepted the story they wanted to hear. At the other end of the hall stood Dada. He had not wanted to come. He had already decided that once Io's eyes were uncovered, his part in the arrangement would be finished. He had spent 3 years pretending to be another man, and now the real Sean had returned. Dada wore a simple dark tunic instead of the expensive suit the family had offered him. His hands were still marked with blue stains from indigo work. He kept them behind his back, hoping nobody would notice. Io did not know he was there, or at least that was what he believed. The physician stepped forward. "We will begin." The room became completely silent. The first layer of gauze was removed. Io flinched. The second came away more slowly. Her breathing became uneven. When the final bandage was lifted, she kept her eyes closed. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The physician placed a hand lightly on her shoulder. "Open them when you are ready." Io inhaled. Then she opened her eyes. At first there was only brightness, a painful, shapeless brightness that made her immediately close them again. Tears ran down her cheeks. The room blurred. She tried once more. This time shapes began to appear. A ceiling, golden lamps, white clothing, dark clothing, human faces that had existed in her memory for years without form. Mama Anola was the first face she recognized, older than she had imagined, more fragile, more beautiful. Io began crying. "Grandmother." Mama Anola covered her mouth. The room filled with quiet sobs. Io looked around, trying to understand the impossible fact that the world had colors again. Green, gold, brown, white. Then a man's voice came from directly in front of her. "Io." She froze. Sean stepped toward her. He smiled with tears in his eyes. "I never stopped waiting for you." Before Io could answer, he reached for her and pulled her into an embrace. The room erupted in whispers. Sean held her tightly, speaking into her hair. "I was there every day. Every day, Io. I prayed for you. I watched over your treatment. I never gave up." Io stood perfectly still. Something was wrong. She did not understand it at first. She only knew that her body had become tense. Then she smelled him. A heavy, expensive fragrance filled her senses. It was sharp, sweet, almost suffocating. Io slowly pulled away. Sean smiled at her. "You remember me?" She stared at his face. It was handsome, carefully groomed, exactly the kind of face she might once have expected to see beside her. But something inside her rejected it. Her eyes dropped to his hands. They were smooth, clean. His nails were perfectly shaped. There were no scars, no rough patches, no dark stains beneath the fingers. Io looked back at his face. "Where were you?" Sean's smile weakened. "What do you mean? When I could not sleep? I was here. When I had fever." Sean hesitated. "I was always here." Io's eyes narrowed, then she smelled the perfume again. Suddenly, memories came rushing back. Not images, because she had never been able to see them, but sensations. A rough palm supporting her neck. A thumb pressing medicine onto her wrist. The smell of wet indigo after rain. The faint scent of jasmine. The warmth of sitting beside her when the entire house was asleep. Io stepped away from Sean. "No." The room went silent. Sean blinked. "Io?" She shook her head. "You are lying." Mama Anola stared at her granddaughter. "My child." Io did not look at her. Her eyes moved across the room. She searched every face. Then she saw him. Dada stood near the doorway, half hidden behind two servants, already preparing to leave. He had his head lowered. His hands were behind his back. Io's breathing stopped. She knew those hands. She knew that posture. She knew that quietness. And then the wind moved through the open windows, carrying the faint smell of crushed leaves and indigo across the room. Io closed her eyes for 1 second. When she opened them, she was already walking toward him. Dada looked up in shock. "Io." She reached him and grabbed his wrist. His skin was rough beneath her fingers. Blue stains marked the edges of his nails. The familiar smell of herbs surrounded her. For 3 years, this had been the closest thing she had to a face. She lifted his hand toward her and breathed in slowly. Tears filled her eyes. These hands. Dada could not speak. Io looked directly into his eyes. "This smell." Her voice broke. "It was you." Dada's eyes filled with tears. Sean stepped forward. "Io, don't listen to him." She turned sharply. "Be quiet." Nobody had ever heard her speak with such force since the explosion. She looked back at Dada. "You were the one who stayed." Dada lowered his eyes. "I was supposed to leave, but you didn't." "I couldn't." Io tightened her grip around his hand. "Why?" Dada looked at her for a long moment, then he said quietly, "Because you were alone." That answer destroyed the last piece of doubt inside her. Io turned toward the entire room. still holding Dada's hand. This man is not Sean Olanru. A shockwave of whispers moved through the hall. Sean's face went pale. Mama Anola stared at Dada, and Io, who had spent 3 years trapped in darkness, finally smiled through her tears. But he is the man who became my husband when everyone else walked away. The hall remained silent for several seconds after Io's words. Nobody seemed to know what to do with them. Sean stood frozen beside her, his face drained of color, while Mama Anola stared at Dada as though she were seeing him for the first time. Then Sean recovered himself. "She has only just opened her eyes," he said quickly. "She is confused. 3 years of blindness have affected her memory." Turned toward him. "No." Her voice was quiet, but everyone heard it. "My eyes may have been blind. My memory was not." Sean stepped closer. "Io, listen to me. You were not there. I was. Then tell me what happened on the night I nearly stopped breathing." Sean opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Io continued. "What did I drink?" Silence. "What medicine did you bring me?" Nothing. "Which side of the bed did I sleep on?" Sean looked toward Mama Anola as if someone might rescue him. Nobody did. Io turned toward Dada. "He knows." Sean's jaw tightened. "Because he was here pretending to be me." Dada finally stepped forward. "Yes." A murmur spread through the room. "I was brought here under your name." Sean pointed at him. "There. You admit it." Dada did not move. "I was asked to take your place because you refused to marry her." Sean's expression changed. "That's a lie." "Then tell them why you never came to the hospital." Sean looked around the room. His father lowered his eyes. His mother remained rigid. The silence became an accusation all by itself. Mama Anola rose slowly from her chair. "Is this true?" Sean tried to speak, but the old woman raised one hand. "I asked you a question." Sean finally said, "I was afraid." Io stared at him. "Afraid of what?" "Of what my life would become." That answer was worse than a confession. Sean's voice hardened as he continued. "You were going to be blind. You couldn't speak. The family expected me to sacrifice everything." Io looked at him for a long moment. "You didn't sacrifice anything." She glanced at Dada's hands. "You abandoned me." Sean's pride finally broke through his fear. "And what has he done?" "He married you under a false name." Dada lowered his head. "That is true." Io looked at him. "Why didn't you tell me?" Dada hesitated. "Because every day I planned to. And every day you needed someone more than I needed, to be honest." Io's eyes filled with tears. "That doesn't make the lie right, I know, but it makes you different from him." Sean stepped forward angrily. "You cannot reward a fraud simply because you feel sorry for him." Mama Anola struck the floor once with her cane. The entire hall fell silent. "Enough." She looked at Dada. "Who are you?" Dada answered honestly. He told them about his mother Sade, the debt, the agreement with the Olanru family, and the night he first entered the house. Then Chief Akinwal, the elderly merchant who had been watching from the back of the hall, slowly stepped forward. "There is something else," he said. He carried a folded sheet of cement paper. He opened it on the table. The white heron mark was visible beneath a detailed distillation design. "I have seen this work before." Several merchants moved closer. Chief Akinway looked directly at Dada, the white heron. Dada said nothing. "You designed the filtration system used by the Ajayi Botanical Cooperative 2 years ago." Dada finally nodded. "I helped design it." The room changed again. The poor indigo dyer, whom Sean had considered disposable, was suddenly standing in front of some of Lagos's most powerful merchants as the anonymous mind behind innovations they had spent years searching for. Mama Anola looked at Io, then at Dada. "You were never what they told us you were." Io smiled through her tears. "No, he was simply never given a chance to show us." She turned toward Sean. "The engagement is over." Sean stared at her. "You cannot do this, I already did." Mama Anola's voice followed hers. "The Olanru family will no longer represent Adewumi interests." One by one, the merchants began withdrawing their support from Sean's family. Contracts were questioned. Partnerships were reconsidered. And as Sean watched the room turn against him, he finally understood the thing that frightened him most. He had not lost Io because Dada was richer, stronger, or more powerful. He had lost her because for 3 years, when she had nothing to offer him, Dada had stayed. The Salt and Fragrance Guild met in a long stone hall overlooking the lagoon, and by the time Sean Olanru arrived, the room had already decided that he was no longer the man it once respected. Merchants who used to rise when he entered remained seated. Men who had once called him brother suddenly found reasons to study their papers. Sean noticed every slight. He also noticed Dada standing beside Io, dressed simply, his indigo-stained hands visible beneath the cuffs of his shirt. That sight burned more than the loss of any contract. Sean had spent his life believing that power came from money, family, and the right clothes. Yet here was a man who had entered the Adewumi estate with nothing but rough hands and had somehow gained the loyalty Sean had failed to earn. When one of the elders introduced Dada as a trusted advisor to the Adewumi botanical operations, Sean finally laughed. "Trusted advisor?" he said loudly. "He is a dye worker." Several merchants looked uncomfortable. Dada remained silent. Sean stepped closer. "A man who stains his hands in blue water has no place at a table like this." Io slowly turned toward him. "Those hands kept me alive." Sean's smile disappeared. "You don't know what you are saying." "I know exactly what I am saying." She looked around the hall. "For 3 years I could not see. I could not speak, and the man you call a nobody was the only person who stayed." Sean's face hardened. "He lied to you." "Yes," Io answered, "he did, and he admitted it. You lied to me and still expect me to thank you." The hall went completely quiet. Chief Akinwal placed his palm on the table. "The Olanru family's contracts will be reviewed," he announced. Another merchant nodded. "So will their transport licenses." One by one, the old alliances began collapsing. Sean watched men who had once depended on his family turn away. He felt something inside him break. Not guilt, not regret, humiliation. When the meeting ended, Io walked away with Dada, leaving Sean alone beneath the fading afternoon light. He stood there for several minutes, staring at his own reflection in the dark glass. Then he smiled. It was a small, empty smile. "If I cannot have the Adewumis," he whispered, "then neither will he." That night, Sean did not go home. He went to a warehouse near the eastern lagoon, where the family still had one remaining boatyard. He sat alone in the darkness, surrounded by unpaid bills, canceled contracts, and letters from creditors. His phone contained dozens of messages from people who no longer wanted to speak with him. But one message stood out. It was from a man who owed Sean a favor. "I know where Dada's mother lives." Sean read it twice. Then he slowly put the phone down. For the first time, his revenge had a target. It was no longer about taking Io's fortune back. It was about taking away the one thing Dada valued more than money, his mother. 2 nights later, Said disappeared. There was no struggle anyone could hear, no broken door, no neighbor who saw anything suspicious. She simply failed to return from the small market near the lagoon, and by sunset her empty basket was found beside the road. Dada received the message just after dusk. The note contained only one sentence. "Come to the old fish warehouse if you want your mother alive." There was no signature. He did not need one. Dada's hands began to shake. He showed the message to Io, expecting her to tell him to stay home and call the police. Instead, she stood up immediately. "I'm coming with you." "No, you don't know what you're walking into. Neither do you." Dada looked at her. "This is my mother." Io stepped closer. "And you are the man who stood between me and death for 3 years. Do you really think I am going to let you walk into danger alone?" Dada wanted to argue, but there was no time. They left through the rear gate with one trusted driver, but before they reached the warehouse district, the driver found the road blocked by a fallen tree. Someone had planned this. Dada and Io continued on foot. The old fish warehouse stood at the edge of the lagoon, abandoned for years after a flood damaged the foundation. Its walls were black with moisture, and the smell of dried fish still clung to the wood, despite the years of neglect. A single light burned inside. Dada stopped outside. "Stay behind me," O nodded. They entered. "Mama?" Dada's voice echoed through the darkness. From somewhere deeper inside came a weak reply. "Dada." He moved forward and saw Said tied to a wooden chair. She was frightened but alive. Dada rushed toward her. Then the door slammed behind them. Sean stepped from the shadows. He was holding a long fish cleaning knife. His clothes were disordered, his face thinner than it had been at the guild meeting, but his eyes were clear, too clear. "You should have left Lagos," Sean said. Dada placed himself between him and Sade. "Let them go." Sean laughed. "You still think you can tell me what to do?" Io stepped forward. "Sean, this ends tonight." He looked at her and smiled bitterly. "You chose him. I chose the man who stayed. You chose a nobody." Dada's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. Sean raised the knife. Do you know what I lost because of you? Io answered. You lost what you never deserved. Something snapped in Sean's expression. He lunged toward her. Dada reacted before he could think. He stepped directly in front of Io and turned his body sideways, taking the attack himself. The knife struck deep into his back. For one terrible second, nobody moved. Dada looked down as though he could not understand what had happened. Then his knees weakened. Io caught him before he hit the floor. Dada! Her hands went immediately to his back, and when she pulled them away, they were stained red. The blue marks beneath his nails were still visible beneath the blood. No, 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 she whispered, pressing her hands against the wound. Dada tried to speak. Your mother, he managed, looking toward Sade. She's safe. Io was crying now. You protected me again. Dada's breathing became shallow. I told you. He struggled for air. I told you I wouldn't let them hurt you. Sean stood frozen, the knife slipping from his fingers. For the first time, he seemed to understand what he had done. But the sound of approaching sirens broke the silence. The police stormed through the warehouse and forced Sean to the ground. He did not resist. His face had finally lost its arrogance. Dada was carried outside on a stretcher, while Io followed beside him, refusing to let go of his hand. Rain began falling over the lagoon. It washed the blood from the wooden floor and carried it toward the dark water. But it could not wash away what had just been proven. Dada had spent 3 years caring for Io when she had nothing to give him. And when danger finally came for her, he had not paused to calculate the cost. He had simply stepped in front of it. The doctors worked through the night, but Dada's wound was too deep. By the time the first gray light of morning appeared beyond the hospital windows, Io was still sitting beside his bed, holding his hand between both of hers. She had not slept. She had not eaten. She had barely moved. Dada opened his eyes once, only once. Io immediately leaned toward him, tears already filling her eyes. I'm here. His breathing was weak. Are you safe? It was the first thing he asked. Not whether he would survive, not how badly he was hurt. He wanted to know if she was safe. Io nodded through her tears. I'm safe. Your mother is safe too. A faint smile appeared on his lips. Then that's enough, Io whispered. It isn't. She tightened her fingers around his. You promised you wouldn't leave me. Dada looked down at their hands. His palm was still rough from years of work, and a faint trace of indigo remained beneath his fingernails. Slowly, he lifted that hand and touched her cheek. I know. Io pressed his palm against her face and began to cry. Then stay. Dada looked at her for a long moment. There were countless things he could have said, but he had never been a man who needed many words. He had always shown what he felt through his hands. He gently brushed away one of her tears. If one day you forget my face, his voice weakened. Io shook her head. I won't. If you ever do, he paused to catch his breath. Don't forget these hands. Io closed her eyes against his palm. I could never forget them. His fingers slowly loosened in hers. The warmth began to leave his hand. Io opened her eyes. Dada? He did not answer. Dada? The room remained silent, and in that silence, Io understood that the man who had walked beside her through 3 years of darkness would never walk beside her again. She bowed over his hand and wept. Not like the heiress of the Adewumi Empire, not like the woman who had once been promised a future built on wealth and power. She cried like a woman who had finally found the person she loved, only to lose him just when she had finally learned how precious he was. Dada was buried beside the lagoon beneath a flowering jasmine tree. Io never held another wedding. When people asked why, she gave the same answer. I already married the man I loved. Instead, she took control of Adewumi botanicals and transformed part of the empire. The old distillation houses were rebuilt. Small farmers around the lagoon were given contracts. Young workers were taught how to cultivate medicinal plants and process indigo. And above every new botanical center, Io placed the same symbol, a white heron. She never called them monuments to Dada. She simply said that some people deserved to be remembered not because they were powerful, but because they used what little they had to make someone else's life better. Years passed. The grief became quieter, but it never disappeared. Then, one rainy afternoon, a stranger arrived at the gates of the Adewumi estate. He wore simple clothes and carried an old canvas bag over one shoulder. He had no recommendation letter, no wealthy family behind him, and no impressive credentials. He simply asked for work in the botanical gardens. The estate manager looked him over. "What can you do?" The man hesitated before answering. "I know how to work with indigo." The manager raised an eyebrow. "Anything else?" "A little herbal medicine, roots, leaves, oils. My mother taught me." Io happened to be walking through the corridor when she heard those words. She stopped. Something inside her tightened for a reason she could not explain. She stepped outside. The stranger turned toward her. He was not Dada. His face was different. His voice was different. Even the way he carried himself was unfamiliar. Yet when he extended his hand, Io stopped breathing for a moment. The hand was rough. There were small scars across the knuckles. A faint blue stain rested beneath one fingernail. Io stared at it. The stranger smiled politely. "Is something wrong?" She did not answer. A breeze moved through the garden. It carried the scent of wet earth, crushed indigo leaves, and jasmine after rain. Tears appeared in Io's eyes before she understood why. "What is your name?" she asked. The man smiled. "Dada." Her heart seemed to stop. He gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I know. It's an unusual name." A step closer. She reached for his hand and touched it gently, almost afraid that the moment would disappear if she held it too tightly. The stranger looked confused. "Are you all right?" Io smiled through her tears. "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. "You just remind me of someone." "Someone important?" he asked. Io turned toward the lagoon. A white heron stood motionless among the reeds. "The most important person I ever knew." The stranger followed her gaze but said nothing. Neither did Io. A moment later, he rubbed his thumb slowly against his index finger, testing the faint residue of indigo on his skin. Io froze. Dada used to do that whenever he was thinking. It was such a small habit that nobody else would have noticed. Perhaps it meant nothing. Perhaps thousands of people did the same thing without realizing it. Perhaps grief simply teaches the heart to find familiar shapes in strangers. The man turned toward the garden. "Where should I begin?" Io looked at him. For one brief second, she remembered a dark room, 3 years of silence, and a rough hand reaching for hers without asking for anything in return. She almost called his name. Instead, she said, "Start with the indigo garden." The stranger nodded and walked away. Io remained where she was, watching him disappear between the rows of blue-green plants. No one could prove that he was connected to the man she had lost. No one could explain the coincidence of the name, the hands, the indigo, or that tiny familiar gesture. Maybe he was simply another man carrying the same name. Maybe somewhere in the world, love leaves traces that appear again in people we never expected to meet. Or maybe some bonds are not as easily broken as death would have us believe. Above the lagoon, a white heron suddenly lifted into the gray afternoon sky. Io watched it until it disappeared beyond the rain. Then she looked back toward the garden. For the first time since Dada's death, she allowed herself to smile. She did not know whether she had just met a stranger, a reminder, or something she would never be able to explain. And perhaps that was the only answer she needed. Because sometimes, the people we lose do not return to us in the way we want. Sometimes they return as a memory, a habit, a scent, a pair of familiar hands reaching toward us from an unexpected life. And sometimes, when the heart has suffered enough, it does not ask for proof. It simply leaves the door open.